Los Angeles, doing our Thursday night program tonight. We have a special guest with us tonight. I think it's going to provide some really interesting insight into something that people either believe in or don't, or have all kinds of opinions about, but I find it fascinating. I've been looking forward to this talk for a little bit. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that not only can you watch us every Thursday night here on YouTube channel, you can come down here to the LA Adventurers Club and have dinner with us and watch the program live. So check out adventurersclub.org for programming coming up, and get yourself down here sometimes and see some of these interesting programs in person. So we have with us tonight Schmitt. He's an author, has written extensively about the incident at Roswell. For those of you who may not be familiar with that, I can't imagine there is anybody, but basically a flying saucer supposedly crashed out there, and then ensued a great cover-up after recovering what there was, and
it was a weather balloon.
yeah.
Everybody knows that.
So we're going to talk about that tonight from someone who's got a lot of the detail around it, spent a lot of time researching it. Before we get into the topic, let me introduce Don Schmitt to you. Welcome, Don. Appreciate you joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thank you for having me.
Can you, before we get into the meat of it, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up being sort of a Roswell expert?
Well, I had the wonderful opportunity of being a special investigator for the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was a consultant on the Air Force and Project Blue Book for almost 20 years. And Blue Book being the most famous of the three official government investigations of the UFO phenomenon. And after he founded the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, he was head of the astronomy department at Northwestern University in Evanston. And I became his director of special investigations. And after that, I was on his board of directors for 10 years, and I was a skeptic. And the one case I wanted to go after was Roswell. We were so confident we would make a single weekend jaunt down to the land of enchantment and prove that it indeed was a weather balloon device, as the government still maintains after all these years, or something just as prosaic. And here we are all these years later. We have interviewed over 600 witnesses, either directly or indirectly involved with what happened back in 1947. I've had 7 best-selling books on the incident. The first one was made into the Golden Globe nominated Best Picture, Roswell, starring Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, Dwight Yoakam. I've supervised 5 archaeological digs at the crash site, still searching for physical evidence of the crash. And I'm one of the co-founders of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, which has to date drawn over 4 million visitors from all over the world. And as you were suggesting, Ken, that how could anybody not have heard about Roswell after all this time? It truly has become a household word, even around the world, in that I've been most fortunate in that I've lectured throughout China, Japan, Australia, South America, through Europe, even Russia, Canada, Mexico, and in every state except for 2. On this very topic. And I can assure all of you that Roswell is no longer synonymous with any form of weather balloon or aircraft of any conventional sort. It is truly something that connotates the very essence of something manufactured off the planet, something not made here. And based on over now 30 years of research, I have gone from a total skeptic to where now when I'm asked, Don, do you believe? I say, no, I don't believe, but I'm 99% convinced. big difference. And it's something that Dr. Hynek, I'd like to believe that he's looking down, and his wife Mimi would often say to us, you know, Alan would be so proud of you boys. And coming from her about someone as who will always go down as the foremost authority on the subject. I couldn't be, you know, more grateful to hear such words.
So I just, when I was younger, I read everything I could lay my hands on. My teachers used to send me to the library to get rid of me. And I was just fascinated with the whole idea of UFOs, and Roswell in particular stuck with me because seemed like it had the most actual physical evidence and number of witnesses throughout the whole process. And I just went through your book, Cover Up at Roswell, which is a great book. And it just refreshed the immense amount of eyewitness testimony and evidence, and everything around it is just overwhelming, really. So you're here tonight to talk to us a little bit about that, and so tell us about your experience with Roswell and what you believe at this point.
Well, and again, not what I believe, but what I'm convinced of. Yeah. And even by the very title of the presentation this evening, the undeniable truths about Roswell, the truths that even the skeptics, you know, cannot deny. And I always like to start with just a short history lesson, because I find, especially when I lecture on college campuses with the faculty present, I'll often pose the question, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? And you'd be surprised how many of the learned professors, well, of course, Japan. Well, no, how about New Mexico? How about July of 1945, just 2 hours west of Roswell? And then you had ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, just north of Albuquerque. You had all the testing of the captured German V-2 rockets from World War II at the White Sands Proving Ground, just south of where Trinity, where the bomb had been detonated. And just south of Roswell, you had the Roswell Army Airfield, which was the headquarters of the 509 Bomb Wing, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world. It was an elite composite squadron where they selected the best officers, the best pilots, crew, doctors, nurses. If you swept a broom on that base back in 1947, it was because you were the best sweeper in the entire US military. You all had a top security clearance with the atomic bomb. And as I had mentioned, Dr. Hynek with Project Blue Book, according to Project Blue Book, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico at that time than anywhere else in the world. It was as though someone else was very interested in our military potential at that time. And late evening of July 2nd, 1947, severe lightning storm in the high desert of Lincoln County, that's in the central part of the state. And ranchers described to us that they heard what sounded like an explosion between the thunderclaps. And it was the next morning that a ranch foreman by the name of W.W. Brazo discovers a debris field of the strangest material he had never seen before. It, you know, he could not identify any of the wreckage that had been strewn throughout this open pasture. And neither could the hired hands, neighboring ranchers, even a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins had never seen anything like this before. And it covered an area of almost a mile long. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of wreckage. So it was on Sunday, July 6th, that he made the long trek into Roswell, but he didn't go to the military. he went to the courthouse. He went to the county sheriff, who at the time was Sheriff George Wilcox. And it was Wilcox who then contacted the military. Now, we all need to keep in mind that this was a 4th of July weekend. So most of the base personnel were home on leave. Base was pretty vacant. But who should pick up the phone? Who should take the very call about this crash but the head of intelligence, Major Jesse Marcel? He was the lead intel officer in the entire U.S. military at that time. And he goes to the sheriff's office. Brazel had brought in 2 entire boxes of the wreckage. And Marcel heads back to the base with one of the boxes of this material. Now, nothing has been reported missing. They haven't been testing anything throughout the state. They haven't been placed on alert that should there be any reports of any downed aircraft or testing of any sort. So nothing's been reported missing. No reports of any civilian, any private planes of any sort. So the point being, if nothing has been reported missing, and if this isn't ours, then whose is it? So right there, I mean, the radar immediately goes up, so to speak, figuratively, because my God, what does this represent? And Marcel, he immediately sees it's important enough that he immediately contacts the very base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. So it's at this time, it's rising in relevance as the minutes pass. No one's able to identify this material. The head of intelligence already has retrieved a box of this strange material, and he calls in his boss, the very base commander, to get directly involved. So if you want me to continue, Ken, at this point, or if you,
Sure,
you have any comments or any questions at this point, feel free.
We're reading was sort of a comment about Marcel, that, you know, he's been kind of played the fool over the years, I guess, or portrayed as someone kind of bumbling and mistake-ridden, and but he was the intelligence guy there, and there's a lot of military guys in the audience here who might argue intelligence, but yeah, I mean, this was no schlep.
But nonetheless, he was selected as the lead intelligence officer of the 509 Bomb Wing, in charge of the atomic bomb for a reason. Because at the moment, at that time, it becomes a central issue, that being of intelligence, because they realize that they have the Russians breathing over their shoulders. So they're not playing this lightly. And at the point where they actually have wreckage of potentially a spy plane, a spy device, they have no idea. All they know is this is nothing domestic. They cannot recognize this wreckage. And so Blanchard, the base commander, he dispatches not a couple of enlisted men, not a couple of grunts to go just check it out and humor the ranchers, so to speak. No, he sends out Marcel. And what's also crucial here at the moment, Ken, is the fact that he also sends out the head of counterintelligence, and that being Captain Sheridan Cabot of counterintelligence, in the event it's something foreign. So they're continuing to demonstrate that they have no idea what this is. And so the 2 intel officers, they follow the rancher back to investigate firsthand. They arrive late in the evening, so they have to spend the night in a one-room shack called the Heinz House. It's the very next morning. They travel 3 miles to the south, and Marcel would make the comment that what impressed him upon first seeing the debris field was the vast amount of wreckage. He could not get over just how much wreckage there was. And as I originally described, that it covered an area of almost a mile long. And then he also said that both he and Cavett immediately came to the determination that this had not been an impact crash, that this was a midair explosion. Something happened. Something caused this object to explode, raining debris over an area that covered, an area of almost a mile long. And so Marcel and Cavett would then spend the better part of the day gathering up wreckage. They filled up 2 entire vehicles, one being Marcel's 1942 Buick convertible, his own personal car, and Cavett was driving a Jeep carryall, a Jeep with a box. So it was like a pickup truck. So they loaded up both vehicles. Marcel would send Cavett on ahead. They both arrived early into the next morning, after midnight, at the base, and at noon Mountain Time, the Roswell Army Airfield on Tuesday, July 8th, they put out that famous press release. Again, a matter of historic fact. They announced the first atomic bomb
Just remind them where we left off.
Speakers, the podium, a screen that comes down.
So we've had feed lock up.
YouTube channel, and they started doing
We're working on that.
one.
I was surprised, I didn't realize it was gonna be virtual.
And they do.
Yeah, yeah, I thought it would be here.
Well, most of them are,
Yeah.
except right now, we're
Yeah.
still in this hybrid
Of course.
model.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's, yeah. That's what I was laughing at, I was telling him earlier, I was like, you know what, you guys got it really set up, cause I didn't.
You wanna give him a
think it was
call,
gonna be there,
Ken?
But now I spoke too soon.
Well, typically, we have a speaker, we just figure over and done, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
But we have to adapt. Everything has to
of
adapt.
course,
So,
it is a cool podium.
the podium's cool.
Yeah, the podium's pretty cool.
And the boat behind it, and there's a whole story behind this eagle. Ken Rosenthal.
Yeah,
It goes back.
I'm not sure what's going on. We lost audio also.
And once in a
I
while,
think his connection just dropped on his side.
just left.
My internet
Oh.
dropped.
Oh.
I think there's something in the area.
A year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just really like
Yeah.
the aesthetic setup of
Okay,
like a
thanks.
wooden table with like a fine whiskey bottle.
Our first programs, where they just had somebody sitting there. and
Yeah,
there for
you
the
would
full
drink a glass of whiskey and hang out, yeah. That's what I mean, I
And
like,
maybe
I like the
two?
classics.
So how many in the audience
I like
believe
it's
in
very
UFOs?
classic. It's a beautiful bottle. Wait, what? Oh, sorry.
That's a pretty good number of hands.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
How many believe in UFOs?
No, Ken, how many?
I had
seen it?
last night with,
Yeah. How many people think they've seen a UFO? Okay.
Come on, how many people have
That's
been
three people.
abducted by? How many people have been sexually molested by?
No, if we're
Keep your hand raised, Larry.
How many volunteer for the next?
Somebody can't wait for it.
I can try to fill some content here.
Yeah.
Having not seen a UFO, having operated a radar plane for over 1,000 hours, and when I say not seen, there really is a story about that, because it turns out I couldn't see the F-117. when we were practicing in Fallon, Nevada as a Navy Air Wing working up. And the Navy at night is flying a practice exercise where we get graded and promoted on it, and we're using all our best sensors. And the point of the story is that our sensors work the same way as Russian sensors. The
Your
laws of
computer
physics
shut
are
down?
the same. And so we are trying extra
Can you
hard to
restart
see
for us?
everything in the air. And the Air Force turns out to have been Fallon, Nevada is right
All right,
near,
I'll stay on the line with you, and,
Right
you
near
know,
Area
the
51.
meeting's open, so
it's right
we'll
near
just
where
wait for
the
you to come back here.
F-117 stealth
We've
fighter
got a guy that's
was based, late 80s, early 90s. The Air Force was flying F-117s right through the middle of our exercise range. I couldn't see it on radar, which validated that the system worked, because if we couldn't see it, the Russians couldn't see it with a tall cane or a spoon rest radar.
Yeah.
And so this is my point, that there were literally unknown flying objects in the middle of our highly surveilled military air defense system. This proved to our government that our stick worked. So I am in this room not having seen a UFO when there was a UFO there. And that makes me a little skeptical. I think the usual answer is I look to our government first, their government
Say that again?
second. But I try to keep an open mind.
Yeah, right? The government wants to keep this out of the public eye.
Didn't they tell you that this was a test?
Your mic's off.
This is a test.
Yeah. He said his computer restarted and had to update Windows or something.
Okay.
Which makes you beg to differ, to think, the technology that we feel we have versus what is actually out there. So,
Ken, maybe just, you ask a question about phone.
Rich is working with him on the phone.
So another thing on point, anyone read a book by Ray Kurzweil about, Ray Kurzweil's Google's chief scientist? He also wants to live forever. He claims he can extend your life to triple digits. But he wrote an amazing book called about Beyond the Singularity, where he points out that any interstellar travel by any mass is going to leave a residual wake, like a boat moving through the water. If there's no mass, the laws of physics say we won't get a radio wave out of it, or it won't hit hydrogen atoms and make them excited or glow with gas. But if there's any physical object traveling between the stars, there's a bunch of gas out there. There's hydrogen atoms. We should see cloud traces of anybody traveling between stars. Not to mention their equivalent of I Love Lucy reruns and their atomic tests and their Chernobyls.
Oh,
We
yeah.
spend a lot of time looking out in the universe, and we're not seeing the footprints. And everyone says, oh, their technology may be different. But again, if you think the laws of physics are the same here, he argues, as they are in other places, and that is kind of the definition of the laws of physics, that we think that actual travel from other places would be detectable with the stuff we're using today in the telescope.
But we're only looking at interstellar, we're not looking at interdimensional.
Touche.
Yeah,
I don't know if you see wakes of hydrogen atoms, interstellar. I mean, they don't even have proof of the Oort cloud, and those are, you know.
I'm just saying you would get excited. We see gas gets hot. Gas gives a signature when you stimulate it with light or anything else. And if you run into it with anything near light speed, it's going to glow.
Yeah, I had some problems earlier today with Zoom. I think they did some updates, and it's not as good as it used to be.
Oh,
So of course we've had our biggest technical problem while the architect of the system's here and on duty.
Yes.
Normally it's just me and Phoebe whose claim to fame is she ran away to join the circus. He never has this problem.
So it could be that all this technology that we've inherited from
The man that is operating our system is trained by the U.S. Navy to operate nuclear reactors, so he may be in on the conspiracy.
So there are a lot of believers that that we actually did recover technology from some of these crashed vehicles, more than one, and then turn that into military advantage under cover of development work. And I suspect that they've put booby traps in this because every time we try to talk about it, everything crashes.
Hey, Ken?
Yes.
Isn't that, after the recovery, they went somewhere, but supposedly in Area 51, some of us may have heard about that area, there are alien spaceships, which the government is performing some experiments with. So what do you think about that?
Well, I just finished his book on Roswell, and I've been going through another book, which I wanted to talk with him about, by a fellow named Philip Corso, who was a military lieutenant colonel who wrote a book about the aftermath of Roswell and what happened with everything that was recovered from there. And I won't spoil it, but highly recommend the read. It's a fascinating look into, he ties enough dates and people and companies, and he went to an awful lot of work to create a fraudulent book if he did that. But it's...
Well, vice versa, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of work to come up with this quote-unquote cover story.
Yes.
Like the so-called weather balloon.
Mm-hmm. So...
I mean, nobody believes that anymore.
Yeah, I think we're past that point.
Long past.
And a lot of people in the, you know, even though they were pressured by the government to retract or keep quiet, you know, a number of people on their deathbeds have come back and said, no, it really was true.
Right, and so this is back in the days where if an FBI agent knocked on your door, that was enough to keep you quiet.
Yes. Sounds like we're making a little progress with reconnecting. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, how's that? Okay, we'll
There we
try part 2. Okay. Canon must be the subject matter.
And we're back. Welcome. So we left off with a Jeep with a container, a box in the back.
Right.
If you can pick up from there a little bit, I'd love to continue.
I guess I should say, let's talk fast just in case so we get in as much information, unless something happens again. So, but I had mentioned that they had filled up at the debris field. They filled up 2 entire vehicles, Jeep carry-all box, like a pickup truck, and Marcel's 1942 Buick convertible. And they drive back to Roswell. They arrive after midnight, early morning of Tuesday, July 8th. And at noon, Mountain Time, the Roswell Army Airfield actually puts out a press release where they claim that they had captured a flying saucer. Matter of historic fact. I like to say they started it. They're the ones who claim they got one. None of the witnesses did. We certainly didn't. Again, I was a skeptic. The point is they put out an official press release claiming that they had one in their possession. And it was Colonel Blanchard, the base commander's boss, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, who then announced he wanted to have a press conference, that he was going to present the wreckage to the press and as a result to the public. But he wasn't going to have the press conference in Roswell, where this all was going down, but he was going to have it at his office in Fort Worth, Texas, Carswell Army Airfield. And I want that intelligence officer here for the press conference. I want that Marcel to bring some of the actual wreckage here. And Marcel was ordered to then get on a B-29 called Dave's Dream. We even tracked down crewmen who were on the flight. And so, again, we can verify the circumstances, the operations officer who was involved, First Lieutenant Robert Shirkey, and how they loaded, Sergeant Robert Porter, how they loaded packages that were wrapped in plain brown paper into the bomb bay of the B-29. But Marcel was up in the cockpit, up in the cabin, and he had a box of actual debris on his lap. Well, they arrive in Fort Worth. They go to General Ramey's office, and Marcel lays out some of the wreckage on the general's desk. And Ramey says to him, I want to see where this happened. So he takes him to a map room. And when they return, Marcel is shocked that the real wreckage is gone. Everything that had been scattered on the top of the general's desk is now missing. And on the floor in front of the desk is a shredded up weather balloon with a radar reflector kite all torn up in pieces, all broken up. And that's when General Ramey waves to the press, come on in, and he orders Major Marcel to pose with some of the substituted radar reflector kite. So we're talking neoprene rubber, reflective foil, wooden sticks, string, and masking tape. Off-the-shelf material that any 5-year-old child would have recognized. And yet, to this day, we're led to believe that the men who were in charge of the atomic bomb knew less about a weather balloon than the people in charge, than a 5-year-old child. First time in history, and the only time in history, that a weather balloon with a radar kite was misidentified as a flying saucer. So Marcel is warned by General Ramey not to say a word to the reporters out in the hallway. They keep him overnight. He's not allowed to even return back to Roswell till the next evening. And he's told, just be a good soldier, Marcel. It's all going to come out. You'll be vindicated. You'll be exonerated. You'll be a hero someday. It'll all come out in just a few years. So he waits 5 years. Well, then he waits 10 years. Well, he waits 20 years, and he's starting to get a little nervous that, I was the patsy. I was the fall god. I was the one who had his picture plastered all over the newspapers with what I knew wasn't what we recovered. I knew it wasn't the actual wreckage. It was the substituted balloon. Well, 30 years later, he is diagnosed with terminal emphysema. And he realizes they're never coming out with the truth. Well, he comes out. He actually goes public. And he states regarding the wreckage from Roswell, quote, being familiar with all materials, both foreign and domestic, this was nothing made on this earth, end quote. So how more direct can you get? I mean, it pretty much sums it all up. The lead intelligence officer in the United States military in 1947, before he dies, states to the world that what we recovered at Roswell was not made on this earth. And what you're looking at here is that substituted weather balloon device. You see the clump of black, that's the neoprene rubber balloon. The reflective foil, that's like foil from a Hershey bar wrapper. The wooden sticks, the string, the tape. I mean, is anybody sitting there this evening? Do you have a hard time? Would any of you claim that was a flying saucer? And these were the people that held it in their hands. And yet, this is the official explanation after all these years. Now, on a variation on the same balloon, they came out with Project Mogul in 1994. It's the same balloon device. And then to account for the bodies, they added the wooden crash dummies, which were a part of Project Excelsior and Project High Dive. So Marcel, as I just mentioned, he described materials as he defined them being made off the earth, off the planet. So for all the witnesses we've talked to, both military, civilian, what have they described to us? Paper thin, metal-like material. Metal-like. They couldn't even determine whether it was metal or not. So they always qualified it. We didn't know what it was. It was metal-like, but it was weightless in your hands. You couldn't cut it. You couldn't burn it. Even a bullet wouldn't penetrate it. Engineers at the base described to us that they took a 16-pound sledgehammer. And I would challenge any one of you, next time you're at a hardware store, you're at a Home Depot, for example, pick up a 16-pound sledge and lift it up. You know, it would go through your car like tissue paper. And yet the engineers on the base described how they had a 4-foot section of wreckage, and they pounded on this material, and every time they pounded on it, it just bounced right off. Not even a scratch. They described I-beam sections of the same material with strange symbology that ran the length of each piece, never decoded. Silken strands of material like microfilament fishing line that you could hold a light up the one end and the light would emit out the opposing end. Well, they're describing fiber optics in 1947. Yet fiber optics weren't developed until around 1970. And then the most amazing material of all, we still refer to it as our Holy Grail. It's what we're still looking for in all the archaeological projects we've had out at the crash site. The same nearly indestructible material. But this you could fold, you could crease, you could crumble into a ball. And every time you would place it down, it would slowly unravel. It would flow like water as it would assume its original shape and size. In other words, it possessed perfect memory. We have nothing like that even today. And yet that's what the witness is. Whether military, civilian, dozens have described to us in those specific details. So I could, tonight, sitting with us this evening, we could have former presidents Trump and Clinton and Carter. We could have the late Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. We could have the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico. We could have the former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson. And each and every one of them would lament the fact that they couldn't get the truth about Roswell. So in other words, there is a truth, even above the office of the president. Just a little over a year ago, Donald Trump Jr. was doing his annual Father's Day discussion with his dad. And the very last question was, Dad, when are you going to open the Roswell files? To which the president responded, I'm asked that question probably more than any other. And then he adds, I know that millions of people go to Roswell. And I mentioned, we've had over 4 million people who have come through our museum since its conception. And then he adds, because I know they want to be where something important happened. And then he closes by adding, I'm working on it. Well, whether he was working on it or whether he just ran out of time, let's add from the opposite political spectrum, Bill Clinton. The last time he was on the Jimmy Kimmel show, this is what they talked about. And President Clinton went on and on how I had 8 years in the Oval Office, and I couldn't get the truth about Roswell. So we're in good company in the sense that, politics withstanding, we're talking presidents, senators, congressmen, governors, who, just like us, are still asking questions about Roswell, still concerned that we're not getting the truth, we're not getting the full story, that they're still covering this up, they're still holding information from even the highest elected officials in the government. So it's one of the reasons that I've worked on this for now about half my life. And as evidence in the book you just read, Ken, as far as cover up at Roswell, they went to extreme measures in shutting this down, silencing the media, not only in Roswell at that time, but also throughout the state, throughout the country. What they did to the military to order them into suppression, what they did to the civilians involved to gain their silence, down to even the children of the witnesses involved. Just imagine any one of you having the military come into your homes and tell you and threaten you with the death of your children if you ever talk about something. And I'm not just talking of an isolated incident. I'm talking about, again, dozens of civilians, the neighboring ranchers, people in Roswell, the sheriff, members of the Roswell Police Department, who had the military come into their homes and tell them that if you ever talk about this again, we will do this to your wife, we will do this to your children, that type of thing. So it's one of the reasons that I very quickly went from being a total skeptic to, my God, we have to get back down to New Mexico as quickly as we can, because this portends to be, if all true, the biggest story of the millennium, because they're not describing anything by conventional means. They're describing something truly extraordinary. And it has proven to be the case after all the years of investigation and research. And it's one of the reasons that it has become a household word throughout the world.
I found it fascinating that for all the claims that this was just a weather balloon, the great extents that they went to go and recover every single little bit from anyone who was in the area who might have pocketed a couple pieces or two.
And we have the one scene, we had the picture of the men on their hands and knees, shoulder to shoulder, as they canvassed the area. I had mentioned that the two intelligence officers, Marcel and Cabot, had filled up 2 vehicles. Well, I didn't mention the fact that there was still so much wreckage out there that it took 50 to 60 troops 3 full days immediately thereafter to clean up every last shard of this wreckage. And the trucks that drove back and forth with boxes full of wreckage and then transporting it back to the base, and the multiple flights that transported debris, not only to Fort Worth, but to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. 3 C-54s loaded wreckage and took them via Kirtland Air Force Base, and then transported by a truck to Los Alamos. There was a freight car that was loaded that went as far as from the East Gate, that went to Ohio transporting wreckage. And there was wreckage that went to the White Sands Proving Grounds. So that's one hell of a balloon that required multiple planes and trucks and freight cars to transport all this wreckage. And then the fact that it was being transported was for testing and analysis. Why in God's name would they have to test and analyze a weather balloon? I mean, again, a child would have recognized it. So these are all these remaining questions that continue to remain unanswered. And that's why we've made every effort to track down every possible witness. Ken, you had mentioned even the civilians that managed to, scurry a piece away before the containment, the cordon, and then the cleanup, the retrieval operation by the military. We have civilians, we have ranchers who described how the military came into their homes and pulled up floorboards in their homes, turned over dressers, flipped over mattresses in bedrooms, sliced open bags of feed for the cattle, tipped over water tanks, went down into storm cellars and broke open bottles, jars of canned fruits, all in the effort to find and recover every possible piece of evidence. Does anybody here believe that they would have been so concerned about remains of a weather balloon that they would have continued this effort well beyond the crash itself? In fact, the ranch foreman, Brazo, his very son, Bill Jr., after heavy rains, would always ride through that region. And he found enough pieces to fill up a cigar box. And one night he was in the nearest town of Corona playing pool. And one of his friends just happened to bring this up and said, Bill, your dad got in a lot of trouble over this. Did you ever find anything yourself? To which he mistakenly, as it turned out, commented, well, yeah, I found a few scraps. Well, who should be at his house, the ranch house, the very next morning but a captain by the name of Emerson Armstrong, who we tracked down, we interviewed, we got him to admit, he acknowledged that, yeah, we paid the rancher a visit and they retrieved the wreckage. He had 3 non-commissioned officers with him as well. And I can't emphasize enough, Ken, that this was 2 years after the incident. So 2 years later, they were still observing, monitoring, they were still spying, making sure that they had every last piece of physical evidence. And this continued on for years. I could mention an incident that happened in the mid-'80s where a family had pieces in a shoebox in Roswell. And they went out grocery shopping. They kept the shoebox in the bedroom closet. And we have a copy of the police report. They returned home. Someone had broken in through the bedroom window. Now, mind you, there was a rare coin collection on the dresser in the room, untouched. The only thing that was stolen was that shoebox of the wreckage of some of these pieces. And this was in 1985. So again, what type of a person would just walk away from all this and go, well, interesting story. Maybe someday we'll get the truth about all this. But our invitation stands to any former president, any senator, any congressman, anyone. Come and pay us a visit at our museum in Roswell if you're looking for some of the truth, because at least we can provide you with answers as much as we have accumulated, as much as we have researched, and as much as we have been able to get over 600 eyewitnesses on the official record, their testimonies, their sworn affidavits, their video depositions, audibly, videotaped. And so you walk away, not just scratching your head, but by going, my God, if this is all true, we are truly dealing with the biggest story of the millennium.
So, I have a question about the crash site, and I've seen talk of a second site.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you might talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. What also fully disqualifies any, type of balloon recovery, was I described the debris field, the fact that it covered an area of almost a mile long. I did not mention, and which we've confirmed in the 2002 dig, which was sponsored by the Contract Archaeology Department at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And the last day we were there, they brought in an archaeologist that specializes in excavation using a tractor with a backhoe shovel. And we had flagged specifically where the eyewitnesses, independent of one another, told us there was a gouge, that something had impacted, something had skipped across the ground for hundreds of feet. It was about 10 foot wide. It was several inches deep and long filled in with sediment, with the prevailing winds and the rain erosion, that type of thing. But during that 2002 dig, and we had them dig perpendicular to where the eyewitnesses had described this gouge. And I will never forget the head of the archaeology team, Professor William Dolman, calling me up. He was elated. He was beside himself. Don, it was exactly where the eyewitnesses described it. There it was, that the shovel was jumping. It was hitting a pocket of sediment. And the engineer was there to also witness and photograph the procedure. And as the shovel pulled it away, pulled the ground away, there it was directly below the surface, a symmetrical V. Exactly where the eyewitnesses said.
So
the furrow, the gouge was located. Something had impacted. And it was a larger piece of wreckage that, as it turns out, the rancher had dragged from behind his pickup truck and stored in a livestock shed the night before. So are we freezing up again?
We still got audio. Keep going. We're good.
Okay. So yeah, it's a good picture of me, I know.
Yes. There we go.
There, okay. It's trying to come back, okay.
It recovers.
Modern technology. It tries. Well, we have to give it a kick more times than not. But Ken, you had mentioned another site about 25 miles to the east, southeast of the debris field.
Yes.
Was another site that was located by a team of archaeologists that was headed by Professor William Curry Holden from Western Texas Tech. We even interviewed him, and he confirmed he saw everything, which amounted to the remains of a capsule, a pod, egg-shaped, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And that's where the bodies were recovered, including a lone survivor. So you have a debris field, and then you have this egg-shaped pod, and then there were two deceased, two bodies, and a survivor that was recovered. And the survivor was witnessed by both civilian, the archaeologist, by the sheriff, and one of his deputies, and a crew chief from the Roswell Fire Department by the name of Dan Dwyer, and a firefighter by the name of Ed Reeves. So they also managed to arrive out at the site just as the military cordoned off the area. So you have both military as well as civilian witnesses to the survivor. And what you see now is a composite that was put together based on all the eyewitness testimony by Mike Hill, who is famous there in Los Angeles for doing a lot of the prosthetic movie props that, for example, the movie Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, he created as far as the perfect head replicas of Arnold Schwarzenegger for that movie. And he's done it for Superman with Christopher Reeve. And if you go to Mike Hill Art, just some unbelievable, fantastic as far as examples. And that he worked with us and the witnesses. And the one thing that they emphasized over and over again, that the survivor was childlike. There was nothing monstrous, nothing threatening, nothing fearful about this being, this entity. And we finally believe, it took us 5 years, that we believe we've captured not only the exact appearance, but also the expression, the idea that this could be something that could confront you on a street and you wouldn't be recoiled. You'd almost be willing to walk up to it and engage it, shake its hand. And that's how the eyewitnesses described it, that there was nothing threatening. In fact, they felt pity. The fireman, Dan Dwyer, said that he immediately felt his heart broke for the fact that he saw the two deceased and that the survivor couldn't do anything to even assist his two comrades, so to speak. So we believe that we've captured it here with what you see on the screen. So two specific sites, a debris field and then an impact site, much closer to Roswell.
Now so they recovered a craft.
Correct.
And do we know where that, what happened to that craft? Or
from all indications, it went first to White Sands. What's interesting is that the head of Air Material Command at that time was 4-star General Nathan F. Twining, Sr. And Twining was to have done an inspection of the Boeing aircraft facility in Kansas City at that very time. Well, he canceled out. And in fact, there is a copy of the letter he sent to the president of Boeing at that time. We found it at the National Archives, where Twining apologized that due to a very sensitive incident that happened in New Mexico, that he had to postpone his inspection. Well, then we learned that because Twining would have raised a lot of attention, should he have gone directly to Roswell, he went to White Sands. And that's where, from all indications, the craft, the pod, the capsule, first went to White Sands. And then it came over to Roswell 2 months later. And then we have eyewitnesses who talk about it being loaded into a bomb bay and turned on its side so it could fit. It was more teardrop shaped. And we even have a flight engineer by the name of Newling who described how, as he was doing and this is the hangar that it was kept at. It was called Hangar P3. It's a B-29 hangar. It's now called Building 84. And so as you're all hearing, we have eyewitnesses to every aspect of this incident, down to the men who were on all fours gathering up the wreckage, down to all the special flights, the pilots, the co-pilots, the crew, even those on the receiving end at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, which would become Wright-Patterson Air Force Base just the next January of 1948. And that's why it becomes such a fantastic story, such a fantastic adventure of this one extraordinary event. And again, I want you all to keep in mind The military started this. The government started this. They put out the press release on Tuesday, July 8th, claiming they had one. 5 hours later, General Ramey explained it away as a weather balloon. And you heard how they did that. And they nearly got away with it. And except for Major Marcel, 30 years later, when he was dying of emphysema, who was the fog guy, who was the patsy, who finally went public and said, I'm going to have the last word. It's the last thing I say before I die, that the world's going to know the truth. And what I recovered at Roswell back in 1947 was not from this earth.
So I have a sort of a side tangent to take, if you don't mind.
Not at all. Not at all.
I mean, if you have any commentary on it, if you don't, that's fine too. Reading some material from a book by Phil Corso.
Oh yes, I knew Corso very well.
Okay. Basically, he talks about the aftermath and what happened to all of that material. I was wondering if you have any insight or opinions or thoughts on that.
Absolutely. In fact, I had the good fortune of interviewing the late Colonel Philip Corso on 2 occasions. I found him to be a gentleman. I found him to be highly believable. And unfortunately, books get sensationalized. He didn't write the book the day after Roswell. And it's a big book. It's a thick book. And especially when you're writing the account of one individual, you have to add a lot of fluff. You have to add a lot of material that may not have been relevant or even that accurate. But Corso's description of the assimilation into the private sector, we had already written about just a few years before, because we had eyewitnesses to that effect. Now, we all realize that the government/military doesn't manufacture anything. Everything is contracted out into the private sector. And as a result, whether it's every tank, every plane, every ship, every bullet, every rifle for that matter, is all from private corporations. And the fact that we've interviewed firsthand witnesses from Boeing, from Lockheed, from Battelle Institute, from Rand Corporation, from Hughes Aircraft, from Los Alamos, from General Electric, all describing testing the Roswell material, that they were all asked to make an attempt to find the on button, so to speak. And if there was any chance that they could reverse engineer the technology. And I, for one, I still, very flatly state that after all these years, it still remains a cover-up of ignorance, that they can't figure it out. They can't bridge the technology. In many respects, it's an example of human arrogance. It's like Will Smith in the movie Independence Day. He jumps right in the cockpit and he's able to fly that, alien craft like he's done it 100 times before. Well, again, sorry, as far as from all the firsthand accounts at all the national laboratories, at all the major contracted military manufacturers, they still cannot find the on button, so to speak. And so Corso was correct about that. It's just that we further verified with our own witnesses what he described, that they did indeed make every effort to find out essentially what made that thing fly.
And is that, you said you had written about it before, and where would someone find that if they wanted it?
Well, the book's long out of print, but the book dates back to 1991, a UFO crash at Roswell. And it was the book that was made into the movie Roswell. That was then nominated by the Golden Globes. So that's how many years, again, we've been on this case, but we've we've lost to the undertaker, so to speak. And we often would make that comment, Ken, that we were racing with the undertaker. And here with the last of the World War II generation passing on, that part of the game is over. But we are still tracking down and talking to family members in many cases that acquired deathbed testimonies, which, as we all know, are admissible in a court of law for a reason, because people just don't lie to their loved ones just prior to their deaths. That's when they usually open up and, finally, tell the truth, maybe after a lifetime of withholding something very sensitive, very secret. And down to a man, they're attesting to their being part of the recovery operation, seeing the wreckage, handling the wreckage, and seeing the bodies. And even more importantly, how many of them will swear to their families, and one survived. We saw the survivor. One was alive.
Fascinating. Are you interested in taking some questions from the audience at large?
As long as we have a good connection, let's go. I mean, I'm just happy that as disjointed as this all was, that I hope at least it has had some cohesiveness and some comprehension and understanding. So,
What happened to the survivor?
what happened to the survivor? Well, we have the testimony of Colonel Marion Magruder. He was called Black Mac. He was a triple ace from World War II. And we have numerous testimonies, not only at the impact site, as I had mentioned, but then also at the B-29 hangar P-3 back at the Roswell Army Airfield, and also testimonies from doctors and nurses at the base hospital. So then obviously, well, what became of the survivor beyond that? So Colonel Magruder, he was part of the War College, class of 47, 48. And these are all high-ranking lieutenant colonels and colonels that are being trained specifically in foreign espionage, in foreign intelligence. And they were assigned in April of 48 to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. We can document that. We have those documents regarding Colonel Magruder and his special assignment with the War College in April of 48. And he told his 5 sons independently how they were taken into a room and they were presented with wreckage from just the July before, from Roswell, of the memory material, of this material that you couldn't cut, you couldn't burn, weightless in your hands, nearly indestructible. And no matter how often or whatever you did to it, as far as creasing, folding it, crumbling it up, you laid it down, it flowed like water. It just smoothed right out. Well, according to Magruder, they were then taken into another room. And there was a glass partition. And the lights came on, and there, sitting in a chair with its head down, and then they realized, my God, that the head was much larger. And then the head looked up, and then they saw the eyes. And they were told that this was the survivor from Roswell, and that they were testing it. They were performing all types of physiological, biological tests on it. And Magruder also made the comments to his sons that he felt that they were mistreating it, that they were treating it like a laboratory animal, and that he felt a compassion. He felt almost like, I wish I could help this being. And yet here we were treating it like it was something beneath us. And his one son asked, "Dad, did you hear anything thereafter?" And the colonel, according to Mark, the one son, said that it was his information that it had died a short time thereafter. So that's the last information we have about the survivor, even secondhand from the surviving family of Mary Magruder. But nonetheless, from a very high-ranking officer, the War College, triple ace, World War II, and independently from his 5 sons. So the rest is all rumor. So we have a lot of rumor about a survivor at Wright-Patterson years thereafter. But again, no eyewitness testimony in that regard.
You know, presumably when this individual died, there would have been an autopsy done, correct?
Yes. In fact, we have 2 specific doctors that wanted to remain anonymous. But then there was another doctor by the name of Dr. Leon Kasarian, who worked as far as with NASA in the space program, and where NASA was doing a lot of testing. In fact, a number of the astronauts, including Neil Armstrong, received much of their training at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. And Kasarian had talked to a colleague of ours, one of our investigators by the name of Anthony Dragalia, that it was the contention of those within NASA as well as the Russian space program that they found it curious that the longer the human species would remain in a zero gravity condition, that we would start to resemble the bodies recovered at Roswell. So that they made that that connection. So we found that quite amusing that he would even say that it was something they had discussed even with the Russians at one point. And so it's just that we can plug in all these different witnesses, that Roswell always appears to come into the discussion, not as anything of ours, but again, something of theirs, something beyond, our own comprehension, something that we weren't testing, something that we weren't working on, and certainly, so no discussion from anyone that this was any type of weather balloon device. That has never, no. In fact, when I talk about us having interviewed over 600 witnesses, if you were to ask me, how many witnesses does the government have concerning the weather balloon device? Absolutely 0, none, nada, not a one. After all these years, they have not been able to provide a single witness.
We have lots of eager questions out here.
I'm just glad we have a good connection.
I'm just glad they're behaving themselves fairly well so far.
Well, if they'd like to throw anything at me, it'd be a long throw, so.
So, I believe it was Ben Rich that,
Yes.
from Skunkworks, that quoted the phrase, "We had the technology to send E.T. home."
Yes, I saw the letter, even signed by Rich.
And I
Correct.
don't know if this was to Kelly Johnson or to another Skunkworks employee, but do you believe this is technology that was adopted from what happened at Roswell?
Right. I personally believe he was touting his own horn at the time. I think it may have been just sending a message to competitors, possibly even to adversaries, because obviously it becomes quite a trump card on the bargaining table, whether you're appealing to Congress for, as far as an increased budget, Terry, as far as monies for future, as far as projects, or even in dealing with our foreign adversaries. Just the thought that, well, we have one and we're reverse engineering it. We're going to make it fly. And I tend to be much more reserved. And as I said earlier, that I remain more convinced that it's a cover up of ignorance, that they still can't find out what makes this thing fly, so to speak. I had a flight engineer from Roswell. He was with the 393rd Bomb Squadron. His name was Sergeant William Ennis. And they were in charge of the silver plates, as they called them, the B-29s. Just imagine a fuselage of a plane that you could polish down to the point that it would shine like chrome. And that's what they would do with the B-29s. And they could take these aircraft apart down to the last rivet, put them back together again. And yet before he died, I'll never forget how he put his hand on my shoulder and he went, Don, before I go, you got to find out how that damn thing, back in 47 flew. It didn't have a moving part on it. So how do you reverse engineer something with no parts, no moving parts, so to speak? And, screenwriter Tracy Torme, I think he comes up with, the best analogy. You can imagine if you could take something as simple as a toaster oven, and you could teleport it back in time, say back to the Middle Ages, and they might be able to take it apart, put it back together again. But if you can't plug it in, you're never going to get it to work, correct? So if that's the case, I think, again, it's an example of our human arrogance that if we can't bridge the technology, all they can do is bury it, crate it up and hide it. And maybe every so many years they go back to it and they try it all over again. And, we're still flying rockets and still flying jet planes and still using, the same old fossil fuels. We're getting there. But, the whole thought, and I use the word thought, the very concept of thought projection, the idea that you crawl into the driver's seat, so to speak, and you tell it what to do with your very mind. And we're getting there ourselves with driverless cars and drones and all types of things that step by step, we're getting to the point that maybe as influenced by something that we recovered back in 47, who can say? But nonetheless, the thought that the Ben Riches of the world could say that we already have been to Mars, we have technology that, already has taken us to our nearest, neighbors in our own solar system. I think that's still a stretch. I'm waiting for the evidence to demonstrate that. Astronomers can claim to see the flags posted on the lunar surface and the rover that was left there as far, but we still haven't seen that planted flag on the surface of the red planet on Mars. So until I see that, I'm gonna wait, reserve as far as acceptance that we've sent anything beyond unmanned probes to Mars at this point.
One more question, if I may. At what point, what was the information that you received that changed you from a skeptic to convinced?
Good question. And that was all of the first-hand witnesses describing the characteristics of the wreckage. That one by one, I'll give you an example. The son of the very rancher, when we met with both he and his wife, Shirley, for the first time, And even listening to his wife describe how, yeah, my husband Bill, he kept this one piece in his leather chaps. And every night he'd sit down to dinner and I would serve him. And I'd watch how you take that piece out, and no matter what he did to it and there I am with that's Bill. That after he drove us out in his pickup truck out to the debris field and showed us exactly where he found a number of these very pieces after the heavy rains would wash pieces up to the surface. And his wife Shirley describing how no matter what he did to it, no matter with his buck knife, what would cut through wire and sheet metal, that it had no effect. And then I'd watch how as often as he would crumble it up and lay it down, and it would just unfold, it would just unravel and just smooth right out across the table night after night after night. And she said how I never got bored watching this. She said it was that amazing. And then to listen to another ranch hand, a young lady, describe how he was trying to impress her, and he brought a piece over to her ranch house, and she's watching how he's opening his hand back and forth, and her reaction was, my God, wouldn't it be great if clothes would be made of the same material and I'd never have to iron again? So it painted, a wonderful visual of what she was observing from a very human perspective. So as we're listening to these eyewitnesses, one by one, whether military, whether civilian, describe those very characteristics. And it's sounding not anything like a plane, and it certainly isn't sounding like any type of balloon device. So as I mentioned, we couldn't get back down to Roswell soon enough. In fact, it was 2 months later. So that was in February of '89. In April, we're already back. We're already back again in June, and we're back at the debris field with archaeologists mapping and laying out a systematic grid at the debris field that very September. So you see how we quickly decided we were going to treat this like it was the real thing, lest we, get caught with our pants down, so to speak, that we'd be playing catch up. We were going to try to move ahead. We were not going to telegraph our investigation as much as we were going to, from there on, treat it as it potentially was the genuine article. And this way, by also shining as much light on our investigation, going public, presenting new information. We did everything from Oprah to Larry King Live to CBS 48 Hours to the Today Show, Good Morning America, CNN reports, by shining as much light as well on the investigation. We realized that not only would it protect us, but also our eyewitnesses. And so this way, the powers that be, they have to keep up with us. They have to, because as much as the military is compartmentalized, we're not. And so none of them, would have the full access to the case as we would in putting this all together. So it became a major advantage as well. And I can just imagine the Pentagon, at times, oh my God, we didn't know about that witness. Where did they come up with that witness? And in many respects, we were plugging their leaks, so to speak.
There's lots of people in the audience that are familiar with Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar being an alleged employee of Area 51, 59, whatever it may be. And his story's been well documented by, I think, the Las Vegas press. Any thoughts on Bob Lazar?
Ken, I'm going to ask you to repeat that if you can. It was pretty muffled.
Yes,
on my end.
I can.
Or even,
so the question was regarding Bob Lazar, and
yes.
what, if any, contact or opinions or thoughts you might have around Bob?
I found myself for years being on the fence with Lazar. I've never met the man because I never was that curious to seek him out, in that we already had so-called whistleblowers who had worked with Project Blue Book, who had worked with Hynek, who had worked at the Pentagon, and claimed to have seen gun camera footage, who had handled wreckage, who had even seen cadavers at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio, that type of thing. And their behavior was much more like Edward Snowden, the the more contemporary whistleblower, in that whether one believes he's a hero or a traitor, nonetheless, his treatment is much more akin to that of a true whistleblower. You have to basically flee the country, for protection. Whereas Lazar was able to freely talk about this with no repercussions, he just, as though he was encouraged. And to me, that smacks more of disinformation. That is like, it becomes like a useful idiot. You just wind them up and just let them go out and just spread a lot of nonsense, so to speak. And that's where I still stand with Lazar, that there has to be a smattering of truth to bait witnesses, to bait other people to accept the information. But nonetheless, without any proof, without any evidence to validate, to corroborate, to verify his information. But a true whistleblower would be more akin to, like I said, to Edward Snowden, that you are releasing classified information and you're in big trouble for it. Lazar never got in trouble for the information he divulged. So that's why I remain very suspect of exactly what he was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
So a question about cover-ups and disinformation, and I also want to link it to former members of this club that were involved in the Glomar Explorer, Project Jennifer, Project Azorian, which had multiple cover stories about picking up the Soviet nuclear sub off the bottom of the ocean. But my specific question is, knowing that this Roswell, as an old Cold Warrior, I know the US military doesn't like to talk about losing nuclear weapons, because they don't talk about them at all. And when they do lose them, they've gone to massive cleanup, haul it away, like tons and tons out of Greenland, tons and tons out of Spain. But knowing that they're building nuclear weapons early on in New Mexico, they're building the B-36 that's going to fly right across the border in Texas. Doesn't Occam's razor say that a simple silver bullet being lost could explain a lot of these efforts? And again, I want to link it back to the US military, whenever possible, can always use not just one cover story. They tell multiple lies, so you don't know which is the true story. That's the Project Azorian reference.
Well, Occam's razor certainly applies if anything could be applied. And in this case, to suggest that this was a broken arrow, for example, that it was something that they were testing of a nuclear nature. If you were to go, or anyone who has looked into the history of the atomic, beyond the Manhattan Project and immediately thereafter, we didn't have any bombs in our arsenal at that time. In fact, the Roswell Army Airfield would have had 2 atomic bomb pits, which both were posted with signs which read, anyone crossing within 200 feet of this area, lethal force is authorized. So such areas existed back then. But both of the pits were empty. Even the bomb racks at that time were kept at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. So there was no such testing going on at that time. Believe me, we have looked into every alternative explanation to apply to this case. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, this was a holiday weekend. Most of the personnel were home on leave. There were no tests being conducted. I had mentioned a German V-2 rocket. There was an attempted launch on July 3rd. There was a chemical spill, flash fire on the launch pad, and a number of men were burned. And the next attempt was on July 27th, so over 3 weeks later. So I can't emphasize enough to all of you that the rancher discovers the debris the early morning of July 3rd. Now, for having flown over the area in small planes and helicopters, it's open range, it's high desert. It is totally unobscured by anything. One thing you see, you note, when you arrive at the scene and then when you fly over it, you can see for almost 100 miles once you are airborne. The point being that if we were looking for anything, if area reconnaissance were trying to quickly retrieve anything that had gone off course, anything that we were testing, that we needed to intercept and retrieve before it fell into enemy hands. And I had mentioned that the Soviets were right there, were breathing down our backs as they were, as far as conducting any test back at that time. They would have retrieved it before the rancher even discovered it. And the rancher doesn't report it till Sunday, July 6th, 3 full days later. Nobody is still looking for anything. I can't emphasize that enough. And if it wasn't ours, then whose was it? For all of the effort, even by the United States government, to place anything else out there of a conventional nature, they have failed miserably. And as I mentioned, they have 0 witnesses to their weather balloon explanation. And as far as it being any type of an atomic test, as I mentioned, we had none in our arsenal at that time. We had expended them both, Fat Man and Little Boy, over Japan just 2 years before.
So, correct me with this comment, but I believe that J. Allen Hynek, his closing statement to the investigation under Project Blue Book was that UFOs were of a physical nature, but yet of a spiritual background. You can, that's I think that's some type of a misconception of the statement itself. But do you believe with what, an understudy of under J. Allen Hynek, UFOs being of a physical interstellar or maybe a spiritual interdimensional?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. And it's no different than when I'm asked, well, what planet do you think they come from? And I honestly answer, it's not my purview. It's not what I'm, as Hynek would say, we're investigating the properties of a phenomenon. And that was one of the things in starting out as a skeptic, when we decided we were going to go wherever the evidence took us. It didn't matter what the final outcome, what the final, resolution in all this. I'm reporting exactly what the eyewitnesses have, related to us after all these years, without any deviation, without variation on that theme. They are describing to their deathbeds, as I mentioned, what they all personally experienced. And I know with Hynek, we would often, gather after a board meeting, and it was like, okay, freely speak. Everything is open, discussion. Lay it all out on the table. And we would get into everything from parallel universe to interdimensional travel to spiritual, as far as if we were dealing with anything of a demonic or even angelic, as far as nature, that type of thing. But that, again, I'm very nuts and bolts. I want to be able to go across the street and kick the tires, so to speak. And that's the wonderful thing that Roswell provides us, in that we are talking about the actual recovery of nuts and bolts, so to speak, of a physical craft and wreckage, and a pilot and crew, so to speak, and potentially a survivor. As to the origins, as to the nature of who, why, and where, I think that still remains a mystery even to the powers that be. I think the cover-up is still a result of the fact that after all this time, we still don't have those answers. We still don't know what we're dealing with. I still have my contacts at the Pentagon. I spoke to Colonel George Vogen, who's at the Pentagon just this morning. And I mentioned his name because we acknowledged him in a number of our books. He was there at the Pentagon on 9/11, for example, when it was hit. And he has often reminded me that, Don, there's a good number of officers here at the Pentagon that think we're dealing with something of a spiritual nature. That because they can't come up with a solid answer, that we have to be dealing with something, you know, on that plane, of that dimension. I don't know. I need a lot more evidence before I'm going to start drawing those conclusions. I'm looking again at the hardware, the nuts and bolts. What makes it fly? What makes it tick, so to speak? And I think for that reason, I leave that to the theologians, to the philosophers, to the scientists who are, you know, even as far as those working within SETI, as far as search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And there too, I think they have a lot more questions they have answers. As far as I'm concerned, we have no answers as of yet.
Mr. Schmitt, are you at all comforted by the fact that this like precious, super sensitive evidence is protected by secrecy and kept secure by whatever department of the United States government?
I'm going to have you have Ken repeat that for me if you could.
Distorted? Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the question.
I asked if you are at all comforted by the fact that this precious, super sensitive evidence is protected by secrecy and kept secure by whatever department of the United States government.
I only picked up a little of that, Ken.
Okay, I think the question was, are you at all comforted that whatever was recovered remains under the protection or secrecy of the U.S. government?
Good question, because when I'm asked today, do you believe the government, or where do you believe the government or the military is still housing the physical evidence? I think that's where, getting back to Ben Rich, and I think what even President Dwight Eisenhower's warning when he left office about the military-industrial complex, I think in many respects that as they have the greatest lobbying effect in Washington, as they essentially arm and provide for the military, that they have the greatest amount of influence over political affairs around the world. And as a result, if such technology is assimilated into the private sector, they then take possession. And I think it's because of that the private corporations have the biggest carrot, the biggest stick of all, so to speak, in the reality of the UFO phenomenon. I think that the vast majority of high-ranking officers in the military know nothing about this subject. And especially if, again, it's controlled by the Ben Riches of the world. And so that's why when I'm asked, well, where is it today? I say it's strictly in the hands of the private corporations. And that may be why the government is all the more reluctant to acknowledge anything, because they really have nothing to display. They have no answers themselves as to disclose, because they're as just as much in the dark as we are.
Okay. Well, I think that's the last of our questions. Oh, no, we have one more.
I'm sure we've all heard of Germany and the 40s and the bad weather in Europe at the time. It was raining down bombs and shit. But when was the first UFO noticed in Germany, and when was Hitler actually associated with getting some extraterrestrial technology to make rockets and shit? Do you know that date?
So Ken, the question is, when was the
Yes.
first UFO?
I think the question was there's some evidence that Hitler may have recovered some craft or benefited from, or
There's been in history, it's like, Hitler and the Second World War has always been associated with him having some kind of extraterrestrial technology beyond ours.
Well, there's no question that Hitler was very much into the occult. There's no question that the Germans.
Does anybody know?
Well, I've lectured in Germany a number of times, and I've even sought out evidence and information, such as through Robert Fleischer and Michael Hessman, both in Germany.
Yes.
And there's evidence to suggest that Hitler, that the Nazis were experimenting what was called the German Bell, which was almost like a top-shaped craft that supposedly would have anti-gravity propulsion, electromagnetic, that it would literally be able to use our own gravitational field to propel it, to maneuver it through the sky. From all indications, it was strictly on the drawing boards. There were no prototypes, no working models ever devised. My God, if the Germans ever would have come up with anything that would have been anti-gravity, anything of that sort back at that time, we might all be speaking in German right now. So I think the Germans, no question, were advanced in their rocketry, in their jet propulsion, especially like with the V2 rockets. I mean, my God, the Germans were experimenting with two-stage rockets, the A-10 at that time, with the intention of striking the eastern coastline of the United States. Their Me-262, as far as their twin jet engine fighters, their Comet 263 rocket-propelled fighter, for example. But as far as a saucer-shaped craft, I've seen drawings, I've seen plans, but again, no prototypes that I've ever seen. And I've been to Germany and I've researched that, and nothing that convinced me that they had any working models, no.
Okay. Well, Ron, thank you very much. We really enjoyed this talk.
As disjointed as it was, but we made it work. We made it work. And wouldn't it figure that here at the tail end, it's working the best?
Of course. Before we sign off, do you have anything that you'd like to share with us as far as if people are interested in your books or website or anything that you'd like to share so we know where to find you?
Well, presently our website is down, so consistent with the way things have worked out tonight, so I'm not surprised. But I invite all of you, come and visit us at our museum. I live in Wisconsin, so I get down to our museum now that the witnesses are all passed on, but I still get to New Mexico 4 or 5 times a year. Our museum, we have the largest UFO library in the world. We have our research facility as well. We have scientists, archivists, researchers who will come and spend days at the museum with over 100,000 cases that are publicly accessible. So many of these collections, so many of these groups, they're there, but they're not publicly available. Well, ours are. And so, and all of our books, our more recent books, as you mentioned, Ken, Cover Up at Roswell is available at Barnes & Noble and at Amazon.com, also in Kindle and audio. So we'd like to believe that we could take this into any court of law and win, hands down. I personally have had 2 judges tell me just that. So with the museum and the books and the reception we've had from all around the world, I'd like to believe we're winning. Why else would even the presidents be asking such questions as to what the true nature of the crash back in 47 is? So, and we also point out that next year is the 75th anniversary of the crash. So it's going to be highly publicized through most of next year. So you're going to be hearing and seeing a lot more about Roswell through 2022.
Well, very good. Thank you so much again. For all of you out there watching tonight, don't forget, you could be sitting here in the club with us and sharing in all this excitement. We bring you, every week, bring you some amazing people with very interesting stories and things to learn from. So check us out at theadventurersclub.org if you're in the LA area or anywhere nearby in driving distance. Take the opportunity to see what's on the program and come down and join us. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Have a great evening. Come back next week.
Thank you all.